In his main phase, Ryan taps his mana confluence to cast Thassa's Oracle. Everyone, with their mana spent on preventing silence, pass priority. Thassa's Oracle resolves and its ETB trigger goes onto the stack. In response, Ryan casts Tainted Pact. Tainted Pact resolves, Ryan exiles his library, and then Thassa's Oracle's ability resolves, and Ryan wins the game. With no responses, Flash resolves, Mike puts Protean Hulk onto the battlefield, lets it die, triggering the Hulk. Mike searches up Cephalid Illusionist, Nomads in Core, Thassa's Oracle, and a Deathrite Shaman onto the battlefield. Oracle triggers, and with the trigger on the stack, he uses his Nomads and Illusionist abilities to mill his entire library. Then Oracle's trigger resolves, and playing with power wins the game. He casts Cephalid Illusionist. He then follows up with Thassa's Oracle. In response, Jim casts Containment Priest. Priest resolves, then Oracle resolves. Oracle's trigger goes onto the stack, and in response, Mike activates Nomads and Illusionists, milling his library. Oracle's trigger resolves, and playing with power win the game again. Riker casts Thassa's Oracle. In response, Sean casts Veil of Summer, hoping to find an answer. He draws a card, and sadly does not find anything. Oracle resolves, and with the trigger on the stack, Riker casts Tainted Pact. Pact resolves, and Riker exiles his entire library and puts the last card into his hand. Then Thassa's Oracle's trigger resolves, and Riker wins the game. He draws, and then plays a Forbidden Orchard for turn. He casts Thassa's Oracle. It resolves, and with the trigger on the stack, he casts Demonic Consultation. Consultation resolves, and Jesper exiles his library. Then Thassa's Oracle's trigger resolves, and Jesper wins the game. After Mike has drawn his deck, he casts Cyclonic Rift, bouncing Torpor Orb back to Adam's hand. Mike then casts Thassa's Oracle. It resolves, and Mike wins the game. He casts Verity Circle. He then casts Thassa's Oracle. Oracle enters, and Mike counts up his devotion to blue, counts the cards in his library, sees his devotion exceeds his library, and wins the game. He flashes back Dread Return, sacrificing Hermit Druid, Narcomoeba, and Bloodghast. Dread Return reanimates Thassa's Oracle. Thassa's Oracle enters the battlefield, and Folger wins the game. Folger then casts Dread Return, sacrificing Fate Stitcher, Hermit Druid, and Bloodghast, and targets Thassa's Oracle in his graveyard. Dread Return resolves, Thassa's Oracle enters the battlefield, then the Oracle trigger resolves, and Folger wins the game. Mayhem Devil triggers twice, and Folger deals 2 damage to Deathrite Shaman. Zach responds by activating Deathrite Shaman, exiling Dispel from Ryan's graveyard and dealing 2 to each of his opponents. Ryan then draws a card from the Spell Bomb. Unfortunately, he doesn't draw an interaction spell, and Tainted Pact resolves. Folger exiles his library and then puts the bottom card of the library into his hand, which is a Keen Sense. Oracle's trigger resolves, and Folger wins the game. Folger shuffles his graveyard into his library, and then Folger's opponents all choose the Hull Breacher replacement effect. Folger draws 7 cards, and then creates 21 treasures. Folger transmutes Muddle the Mixture and fetches up a Tainted Pact into his hand. He casts Neoform, sacrificing Elves of Deep Shadow. He fetches up a Thassa's Oracle onto the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter. With the Oracle trigger on the stack, he casts Tainted Pact. He exiles his library and puts Talisman of Curiosity into his hand. Thassa's Oracle trigger resolves, and Folger wins the game. He then presents the same loop but uses Felwar Stone to generate colored mana. Zach mills his entire library. He exiles 3 cards from his graveyard and casts Thassa's Oracle. Oracle enters, and then Zach wins the game. He then mills 18 cards. Max then presents a loop of exiling 3 cards to recast Lotus Petal, cracking it and making a mana, and then exiling 3 more cards to recast Brain Freeze until he mills his entire library. He makes 2 more mana with the Lotus Petal loop. He then exiles 3 more cards from his graveyard to cast Thassa's Oracle from his graveyard. Thassa's Oracle enters the battlefield, and Max wins the game. He casts Eldritch Evolution, sacrificing his other spirit as an additional cost. In response, Zach casts Pact of Negation, targeting Eldritch Evolution. Mike responds by casting a Pact of Negation of his own. Pact counters Pact, and Eldritch Evolution resolves. Mike fetches up a Thassa's Oracle onto the battlefield. With the trigger on the stack, Mike casts Tainted Pact. Zach laments at his poor draws, and Tainted Pact resolves. After a well-fought battle, Mike wins the game. Mike fetches up a Demonic Consultation out of Folger's library and exiles it. He corrects 2 treasures to cast Thassa's Oracle. With the ETB on the stack, Mike casts Folger's Demonic Consultation and exiles his library. Thassa's Oracle trigger resolves, and Mike wins the game. Even though he said he had a 0% chance. Just saying. Mike lied. Just saying. He's a con man. He lied to us. He activates it, fetches up a card into his hand, and then gives the talisman to Ryan. Mike cracks 2 treasures and casts Thassa's Oracle. It enters, and then with the trigger on the stack, Mike casts Demonic Consultation. Consultation resolves, and Mike exiles his deck. Thassa's Oracle trigger resolves, and Mike wins the game. Cannon resolves, and Greg presents a loop of tapping Basalt Monolith for 4, and then activating it to untap for 3. He generates infinite colorless mana with this loop. He sinks this mana into Thrasios, drawing his deck. He casts Thassa's Oracle with an empty library, and wins the game. Cracking Lion's Eye Diamond for 3 red. He exiles 3 cards from his graveyard and escapes his Lion's Eye Diamond. He cracks LED for 3 blue. He escapes Brain Freeze from his graveyard and targets himself. Mike repeats the process of escaping LED, cracking it for blue, and then escaping Brain Freeze to mill his entire library. Mike then escapes a Thassa's Oracle from his graveyard. It resolves, and Mike wins the game. He casts a Mana Crypt from exile. He casts a Dockside Extortionist from exile. It enters, and then Mike creates 4 more treasures. He casts Thassa's Oracle. With the ETB on the stack, he casts Demonic Consultation from exile. Mike exiles his library, Thassa's Oracle trigger resolves, and Mike wins the game. He draws and casts Mnemonic Betrayal from his graveyard through Kess. It resolves this time, and then his opponents exile their graveyards. He casts a Dockside Extortionist. It enters, and Zach creates 12 treasures. He cracks 2 treasures, and then casts Thassa's Oracle from his hand. It enters, and with the trigger on the stack, Zach casts Demonic Consultation. He exiles his library, and then Thassa's Oracle trigger resolves, and Zach wins the game. It enters, and with the ETB on the stack, he escapes Demonic Consultation from his graveyard, paying for both Ristics. In response, Tyler decides to go for one last Hail Mary. He cracks LED for 3 blue and discards his hand. Riel triggers, and Tyler draws 14 cards. He casts a Brainstorm. Mike's Ristic triggers, and he draws a card, taking a damage from Nekuzar. Tyler draws 3 and puts 2 back on top. Unfortunately, he didn't find an answer, and Demonic Consultation resolves. Zach names Hypnox and exiles his library. Thassa's Oracle trigger resolves, and Zach wins the game. He casts a Diabolic Intent, sacrificing Rograk. Ristic triggers, and Mike draws 3 more cards. Ryan fetches up a card into his hand, and then casts Thassa's Oracle. The Ristics trigger, and Mike draws 3. Thoracle enters, and with the trigger on the stack, Ryan casts Demonic Consultation. Ristic triggers, and Mike draws 3. In response, Mike casts Fierce Guardianship for its alternate cost. Ryan responds by casting Pact of Negation, targeting Fierce Guardianship. Ristic triggers, and Mike draws 3. Mike responds by casting Force of Will, paying a life and exiling a blue card, and targeting Demonic Consultation. Ryan responds again, and taps Spire of Industry to cast Red Elemental Blast, targeting Force of Will. Ristic triggers, and Mike draws 3 more cards. Unfortunately, Mike is out of answers, and the stack resolves. Red Blast counters Force of Will, Pact of Negation counters Fierce Guardianship, and Demonic Consultation resolves. Ryan exiles his library. Thassa's Oracle trigger resolves, and Ryan wins the game. He shuffles and arranges the top 5 accordingly. Thassa's Oracle resolves, and the ETB goes onto the stack. Folger maintains priority and casts Tainted Pact. In response, Zach exiles Elvish Spirit Guide from his hand for a green. He cracks his Waterlogged Grove, drawing a card. With Tainted Pact still in the stack, Steven does a Hail Mary and has to cast Demonic Consultation. Ristic Study triggers, and Folger draws. Consultation resolves, and Steven names Force of Will. He exiles the top 6 cards of his library, which do not contain Force of Will. He flips the 7th card, which is a Force of Will, and puts it into his hand. Steven casts Force of Will, paying a life and exiling a blue card, targeting Tainted Pact. Ristic triggers, and Folger draws. In response, Folger casts Dispel, targeting Force of Will. Dispel counters Will, and with Tainted Pact still in the stack, Zach responds. He casts a Force of Will of his own, paying a life and exiling a blue card and targeting Tainted Pact. In response, Folger casts Deflecting Swat for its alternate cost, changing the target of Force of Will to Deflecting Swat itself. Swat resolves and changes the target of Force of Will, Force fizzles, and Tainted Pact resolves. Folger exiles his library and puts the last card into his hand. Thassa's Oracle trigger resolves, and Folger wins the game. It resolves, and Folger now has access to all of his protection he spent earlier in the game. He casts Thassa's Oracle. It enters, and with the trigger on the stack, he casts Demonic Consultation. Folger names Seedborn Muse and exiles his library. Thoracle's trigger resolves, and Folger wins the game. He casts a Soul Ring. He floats mana and casts Dramatic Reversal, untapping his non-land permanents. He casts Silence. He casts Thassa's Oracle. It resolves, and with the trigger on the stack, Mike casts Tainted Pact. Tainted Pact resolves, and Mike exiles his library. Thassa's Oracle's trigger resolves, and Mike wins the game. He casts Ancestral Recall, drawing 3 cards. He casts a Mox Opal. He casts Underworld Breach. He casts Thassa's Oracle. It enters, and with the trigger on the stack, Mike escapes Demonic Consultation from his graveyard. It resolves, Mike names Glorybringer, and exiles his entire library. Thassa's Oracle trigger resolves, and Mike wins the game. Then Brain Freeze resolves, and they all mill cards into exile with void counters on them through Dauthi Voidwalker. Mike recasts Brain Freeze with all copies targeting Mark to exile his entire library. He casts Thassa's Oracle. It enters, and with the trigger on the stack, Mike casts Tainted Pact from his graveyard. Tainted Pact resolves, Mike exiles his library, then Thassa's Oracle's trigger resolves, and Mike wins the game. He casts out Thassa's Oracle. It enters, and with the trigger on the stack, Sean sacks his Tundra and adds another black. He casts Demonic Consultation. In response, Tanner casts Force of Will, exiling a blue card, paying 1 life, and paying for Rhystic. In response, Sean casts Swan Song. Force of Will is countered, Tanner creates a bird, and Demonic Consultation resolves. Sean exiles his entire library. Thassa's Oracle's trigger resolves, and Sean wins the game. He escapes Brain Freeze from his graveyard with all copies targeting himself. He mills the remainder of his library. Zach escapes Thassa's Oracle from his graveyard. Thassa's Oracle resolves, and Zach wins the game. Mike presents a loop of activating Isochron, untapping all of his non-land permanents, netting mana, and reactivating Isochron. He recasts Azami. He presents the same loop, but now taps Azami to draw a card each time. He uses this loop to draw his entire deck. Mike casts Thassa's Oracle. Oracle resolves, and Mike wins the game. Savine's resolves, and Ranger Captain enters. It triggers, and Zach fetches up an Esper Sentinel into his hand. He sacks his Ranger Captain, silencing his opponents this turn. Zach casts Thassa's Oracle. With the trigger on the stack, he casts Tainted Pact. It resolves, and Zach exiles his entire library. Thassa's Oracle's trigger resolves, and Zach wins the game. He then escapes Thassa's Oracle from his graveyard. It enters, triggers, and Zane wins the game. He escapes LED from his graveyard. He cracks LED, adding 3 blue. He escapes Demonic Tutor. He fetches up a card into his hand. Zane then casts Brain Freeze with all copies targeting himself, milling 27 cards. Zane escapes LED once again. He cracks it for 3 blue. He casts Thassa's Oracle. It enters, and with the trigger on the stack, he escapes Demonic Consultation. Consultation resolves, he names Norn the Wary, and exiles his deck. Thassa's Oracle's trigger resolves, and Zane wins the game.
He repeats this over and over, generating infinite mana. He activates Thrasios to draw his deck. He casts Noxious Revival, targeting Thassa's Oracle in his graveyard. Mike puts Thassa's Oracle on top of his library and activates Thrasios. He draws Oracle and casts it. Oracle enters. It triggers, and with no cards left in his library, Mike wins the game. Mnemonic Betrayal resolves, exiling each of his opponent's graveyards and allowing Zach to cast them this turn. Zach taps his Ancient Tomb to cast Gamble from Tyler's graveyard. Remora triggers, and Tyler draws. Zach fetches up a card into his hand and discards a card at random, which is an Arcane Signet. He casts Deathrite Shaman. He follows it up with a Thassa's Oracle. Oracle enters, and with the trigger on the stack, Zach taps Forbidden Orchard, giving Callous Spirit to cast Demonic Consultation. Remora triggers, and Tyler draws. Zach names Hypnox as Consultation resolves and exiles his library. Thassa's Oracle's trigger then resolves, and Zach wins the game.
Zach moves to a second main phase, fizzling Dante's mana. He casts Underworld Breach. He casts Brain Freeze with all copies targeting himself, milling the rest of his library. He escapes Thassa's Oracle from his graveyard. Thassa's Oracle enters, and Zach wins the game. He cracks it, discarding Dresstown into exile with a void counter because Lincoln's Lazov is now back online. He escapes Thassa's Oracle. Thassa's Oracle's trigger resolves, and Zach wins the game. He draws all the cards in his library and puts all lands onto the battlefield tapped. He casts a Mox Opal. He casts a Dockside Extortionist. It enters, and with the trigger on the stack, Lincoln sacrifices all of his artifacts through Krark Clan Ironworks. Then Mike creates 6 treasures. Mike casts Thassa's Oracle. Oracle enters, and Mike wins the game. He follows it up with a Thassa's Oracle. It enters, and with the trigger on the stack, Rust casts Baleful Mastery for its alternate cost, targeting Go Shintai. Noah responds with a Pact of Negation. Baleful Mastery is countered, Thassa's Oracle ability resolves, and Noah wins the game. Thassa's Oracle. It resolves, and with the trigger on the stack, he casts Tainted Pact. He exiles cards from the top of his library until he reveals Demonic Consultation. He puts Consultation into his hand. Zach explains that he has 3 cards left in his library and is trying to play around any possibility of Crom triggers losing him the game. With Thassa's Oracle trigger on the stack, Lincoln casts Cyclonic Rift, targeting Thassa's Oracle. It resolves, and Thassa is bounced to Lincoln's hand. The ability resolves, and Zach looks at the top card of his library, putting it onto the bottom.
He casts his own Thassa's Oracle. It resolves, but the table is all out of answers this time. Thassa's Oracle trigger resolves, and Zach wins the game.
Thassa's Oracle. It enters, and in response, Noah casts Demonic Consultation, naming the Gitrog monster in true fashion. He exiles his entire library, Thassa's Oracle's trigger resolves, and Noah wins the game.
This mana now to cast, crack, and return LED, netting all other colors as well. He casts his commander, Thrasios, Triton Hero. He uses some of his infinite mana to activate Thrasios to draw his library and put all lands onto the battlefield tapped. He casts Thassa's Oracle. It enters, triggers, and Dan wins the game. He follows it up with a Lotus Petal. He plays an island for turn. He casts Thassa's Oracle. It enters, and in response, Zach cracks his Lotus Petal, adding a black. Turgid triggers, and Alex puts Lotus Petal onto the battlefield from Zach's graveyard. Zach casts Demonic Consultation, naming Hypnox, and exiles his entire library. Thassa's Oracle trigger resolves, and Zach wins the game. He repeats this process until he's returned all of his opponent's non-land permanents and looted through his deck. Finally, Drake casts Thassa's Oracle. With no responses from his opponents and with an empty library, Drake wins the game. In response, Lincoln casts Swan Song, targeting SWAT. With nothing else, Swan Song counters SWAT, Bailey creates a 2/2 bird, Pact of Negation counters Offer, and Demonic Consultation resolves. Lincoln names You Are Already Dead and exiles his library. Thassa's Oracle's trigger resolves, and Lincoln wins the game. Zach escapes LED. Channeler and Remorse trigger, Nick and Mike draw, and Zach surveils ad nauseum into his graveyard. Zach cracks his LED, adding 3 blue. Zach escapes Thassa's Oracle from his graveyard. It enters, Zach has 4 cards left in his library, and 4 devotion, so Zach wins the game. He taps his Ancient Tomb to help cast Peer into the Abyss. It resolves, and Zach draws half of his library and loses half of his life, rounding up. Zach casts a Soul Ring. He casts Chrome Mox and Printing Phantasmal Image. He casts a Mana Vault. He casts Thassa's Oracle. It enters, and with the trigger on the stack, Zach casts Demonic Consultation, naming Hypnox, exiling his entire library. Oracle's trigger resolves, and Zach wins the game. Triggers, and Philip draws his 100,000th card for the turn. Then Silence resolves, locking his opponents out of casting spells. Mike casts Thassa's Oracle. It enters, and in response to the trigger, Mike casts Tainted Pact. Remore triggers, and Philip draws. Mike exiles his library to Tainted Pact. Thassa's Oracle trigger resolves, and Mike wins the game. Escapes Brain Freeze and Lion's Eye Diamond over and over again. He does this until he mills Lion's Eye Diamond. He escapes Lion's Eye Diamond. He cracks it, discarding his hand, adding 3 blue. He escapes Brain Freeze and Lion's Eye Diamond over and over again until he mills his entire library. He escapes Thassa's Oracle. Oracle enters, triggers, and Mike wins the game. He escapes Final Fortune, getting an extra turn. He casts Noxious Revival, putting Thassa's Oracle onto the top of his library. Finally, all through, Mike passes, discarding to hand size. During his upkeep, Mike wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and casts Thassa's Oracle. Oracle enters, and with an empty library, Mike wins the game. He casts Demonic Tutor from his graveyard. He fetches up a card into his hand. He casts Wishclaw Talisman from his graveyard. He activates Wishclaw, fetching up a card into his hand and giving Wishclaw to Ryan. He casts Thassa's Oracle. It enters, and with the trigger on the stack, he casts Demonic Consultation. Consultation resolves, and Mike exiles his library. Oracle's trigger resolves, and Mike wins the game. He escapes Brain Freeze, milling more of his library. He repeats the Lion's Eye Diamond and Brain Freeze loop until he mills his entire library. Mike escapes Thassa's Oracle. Oracle enters, and Mike wins the game. Mox Opal. He casts Demonic Tutor. He holds priority, sacrifices his LED, discards his hand, and adds 3 red. He fetches up a card into his hand. He casts Underworld Breach. He escapes LED from his graveyard. He cracks it for 3 blue. He escapes LED again. He cracks it for 3 black. He escapes Thassa's Oracle. Oracle enters, and with the trigger on the stack, Zach escapes Tainted Pact. He exiles his entire library. Oracle's trigger resolves, and Zach wins the game. He activates Anya, discarding Arid Mesa, drawing a card. Unfortunately, he could not find an answer, and Thoracle resolves. Thoracle enters, and with the trigger on the stack, Zach casts Demonic Consultation. In response, Sean casts Pact of Negation. In response, Zach, having it all, casts Force of Will, paying a life, and exiling a blue card, countering Pact of Negation. With no other answers, Consultation resolves. Zach exiles his entire library. Oracle's trigger resolves, and Zach wins the game. Again. He escapes Lion's Eye Diamond. He cracks it for 3 blue. He escapes Brain Freeze, milling the rest of his library. He escapes Thassa's Oracle. It enters, triggers, and Ashani wins the game. He escapes Brain Freeze, milling his library. He continues this over and over until he mills his entire library. He escapes Thassa's Oracle. Oracle enters, triggers, and Mike wins the game. Mike presents a loop of casting Brain Freeze over and over until he mills his entire library. He escapes Thassa's Oracle. Oracle enters, triggers, and Mike wins the game. He then exiles until he finds Underworld Breach, putting it into his hand. He casts Underworld Breach. He escapes LED. He cracks it for 3 black. He escapes Thassa's Oracle. It enters, and with the trigger on the stack, he escapes Tainted Pact, exiling his entire library. Oracle's trigger resolves, and Drake wins the game. It resolves, and with the trigger on the stack, Sean sacrifices Ranger Captain, locking out opponents this turn. He then fetches up an Esper Sentinel into his hand. He casts Tainted Pact. Pact resolves, and he exiles from the top of his library until he finds Thassa's Oracle and puts it into his hand. He casts Thassa's Oracle. It enters, and with a trigger on the stack, he casts Demonic Consultation, exiling his library. Oracle's trigger resolves, and Sean wins the game. He exiles Simeon's Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a red. He casts Rite of Flame, adding 2 red. He recasts Mana Ball. He casts Arcane Signet. He casts Dramatic Reversal, untapping his non-land permanents. He recasts his commander, Rograk, son of Rogoth. He casts Thassa's Oracle. Oracle enters, and with the trigger on the stack, Drake casts Demonic Consultation, exiling his library. Oracle's trigger resolves, and Drake wins the game. He casts Thassa's Oracle. It enters, and with the trigger on the stack, he casts Demonic Consultation. Consultation resolves, and Zack names Shahrazad, exiling his library. Oracle's trigger resolves, and Zack wins the game. He discards a Tainted Pact. He activates Grizzlebrand 3 more times, paying 21 life, drawing 21 cards. He casts a Soul Ring. He casts Underworld Breach. He cracks his LED, discards his hand, adding 3 blue. He escapes LED. He cracks it for 3 black. He escapes LED again. He escapes Thassa's Oracle. It enters, and with the trigger on the stack, he escapes Tainted Pact. Tainted Pact resolves, and Zack exiles his library. Oracle's trigger resolves, and Zack wins the game. Again. Non-land permanents. He escapes Brain Freeze, with all copies targeting himself. He mills some of his library, then escapes Brain Freeze again, milling the rest of his library. He escapes Lion's Eye Diamond. He cracks it, discards his hand, and adds 3 blue. He escapes Thassa's Oracle. Oracle enters, and with the trigger on the stack, he escapes Tainted Pact, exiling his library. Oracle's trigger resolves, and you know what, let's go into the next game. He casts Culling the Weak, sacrificing Facebreaker, adding 4 black. He casts Thassa's Oracle from exile. It enters, and with the trigger on the stack, Ryan sacrifices his Dothy Voidwalker, casting Cal's Demonic Consultation. It resolves, Ryan names Thassa's Oracle, and exiles his library. Thassa's Oracle trigger resolves, and Ryan laughs maniacally at all the YouTube comments a Marduk Oracle win will create. Oh, and he wins the game too. He continues to activate Kinnan until he finds Thassa's Oracle and puts it onto the battlefield. It enters, and with the trigger on the stack, he activates Thrasios over and over until he draws his entire library. Oracle's trigger resolves, and Alex wins the game. With no other answers, Enter the Infinite resolves. Mike draws all of the cards in his library and puts one back on top. He plays a command tower for turn. He casts a Thassa's Oracle. Oracle enters, and since Mike's devotion is greater than the cards in his library, Mike wins the game. He skips his draw step due to Necropotence. He plays an Underground Sea for turn. He activates Phyrexian Tower, sacrificing Rograk, adding 2 black. He casts Tainted Pact. Drake exiles, and exiles, until he finally finds Thassa's Oracle, which is only 2 cards from the bottom, putting it into his hand. He casts Thassa's Oracle. In response, Jordan cracks his Windswept Teeth, pays a life, and fetches up a Breeding Pool into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts Veil of Summer to try and draw a card. In response, Drake casts Swan Song, targeting Veil. Veil is countered, and Jordan creates a 2/2 bird. Oracle resolves, triggers, and with only 2 cards left in his library, Drake wins the game. During his upkeep, Chad loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and activates Hermit Druid. He mills his entire library since he has no basic lands. He flashes back Turn the Earth, shuffling Thassa's Oracle into his library. He casts Thassa's Oracle through Falco, removing a counter from Glen Elendra. Oracle enters, and Chad wins the game. And flickers Mana Ball. They escape Brain Freeze with all copies targeting themselves. Kitten triggers Flickering Mox Opal. Then they mill the rest of their library. They escape Chrome Mox, imprinting Stern Dismissal. They escape Thassa's Oracle. Oracle enters, and Skylar wins the game. Tevish Zot, Doom of Fools, Flickering Dockside through Kitten. They activate Tevish's second ability, sacrificing Crom, drawing 3 cards. They cast Underworld Breach. Kitten triggers, Flickering Tevish Zot. Skylar presents a loop of escaping Brain Freeze, triggering Kitten, Flickering Dockside, creating treasures, and milling their entire library. They escape Thassa's Oracle. Oracle enters, and Skylar wins the game. No other answers, Claire's Silence resolves, locking out opponents this turn. Claire escapes Gamble, randomly discarding Wheel of Fortune. She casts Lion's Eye Diamond. She sacks it, discards her hand, and adds 3 blue. She escapes Brain Freeze with all copies targeting herself, milling her library. She escapes Lion's Eye Diamond again, and sacks it for 3 more blue. She escapes Thassa's Oracle. Oracle enters, and Claire wins the game. He recasts Mana Vault. He recasts Emir Signet. He casts Demonic Tutor, fetching up a card into his hand. He casts Thassa's Oracle. Oracle enters, and with the trigger on the stack, he casts Demonic Consultation. Consultation resolves, and Cal exiles his library. Oracle's trigger resolves, and Cal wins the game. He activates Kinnan over and over again until he puts Thassa's Oracle onto the battlefield. Oracle enters, and with the trigger on the stack, Alex activates Thrasios over and over, drawing his entire deck. Oracle's trigger resolves, and Alex wins the game. Counterbalance, Shredder, and Shredder all trigger. Noah connives Mystic Remora, Chad connives Ponder, and then Chad reveals Ottawara, Soaring City through Counterbalance. Then Oracle resolves. Oracle triggers, and in response, Cal taps his Ancient Tomb and Underground River to cast Tainted Pact. Pact resolves, and Cal exiles his library. Oracle's trigger resolves, and Cal wins the game. He escapes Intuition. He fetches up a Brain Freeze, Final Fortune, and a Derevi, Imperial Tactician. Charles gives him Derevi. Drake escapes Brain Freeze, with all copies targeting himself, milling some of his library. He escapes Brain Freeze again, milling the rest of his library. Drake escapes LED and then cracks it for 3 blue. Drake escapes Thassa's Oracle. Oracle enters, triggers, and Drake wins the game. He escapes Thassa's Oracle. He holds priority and escapes Swords to Plowshares, exiling Drana. He then escapes Chain of Vapor, targeting his Dress Down. Dress Down bounces, then Thassa's Oracle resolves, and Zach wins the game. He mills 21 cards. He sacks his LED, adding 3 blue. He escapes LED and sacks it, adding 3 white. He escapes Silence, locking out his opponents this turn. He escapes Brain Freeze, milling the rest of his library. He escapes Thassa's Oracle. Oracle enters, triggers, and Zach wins the game. He exiles Simeon Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a red. He casts Peer into the Abyss. Peer resolves, Jay draws half of his remaining library and loses half of his life, rounded up. He casts a Mox Diamond, discarding a Tundra. He casts Mox Opal. He casts Chrome Mox, imprinting Time Twister. He casts Thassa's Oracle. In response, Catherine cracks her Lotus Petal for red and then casts Red Elemental Blast, targeting Thassa's Oracle, which was the first blue spell of the turn. In response, Jay casts Pact of Negation, countering Red Elemental Blast. Thassa's Oracle resolves, and with the trigger on the stack, Jay casts Demonic Consultation. He names You Are Already Dead and exiles his library. Thassa's Oracle's trigger resolves, and Jay wins the game. He casts his commander, Thrasios, Triton Hero. He activates Thrasios, drawing his library, putting all lands onto the battlefield tapped. He casts Thassa's Oracle. It enters, triggers, and Daquan wins the game. He escapes Thassa's Oracle. It enters, and with the trigger on the stack, he casts Everett's Demonic Consultation from exile. He names the most dangerous gamer and exiles his library. Oracle's trigger resolves, and Alex wins the game.